Okay, we'll begin. Are there questions?
Sir, is there any estimated range of range for the mass of like WIMP particles?
WIMP particle? Yeah. So it's basically you take it to be above 100 GeV, right? Because if it's below 100 GeV, then you could have produced in particle physics experiment. Okay, assuming that it's weak interaction strength. Okay. Otherwise, of course, if it's if the interaction is smaller, then the bounds are weaker. So it's a model dependent. Okay, but roughly in the standard context, one thinks of this as of the order of 100 GeV. But I think if you look at on the net, the mass of the bound on the masses of dark matter particles, you'll find more information. In particular, this particle data group, they have every year they bring out a list of particle physics data, and there you will find the most recent bound. So there are basically model dependent bounds and model independent bounds.
So, but like it could also be possible that in our lab we could not produce that particle, but there is still a particle with mass less than 100 GeV.
Yeah, so that means that the interaction of the particle must be very weak, right? With the standard model interaction, because we are after all colliding the standard model particles in the high energy physics experiments. Right? So if the interaction strength was the weak interaction strength, then they will be produced in the high energy physics experiments. Yeah, so direct experimental bounds come from there, but there are also various indirect ways of getting bounds. That if such a particle exists, then something else might happen. Right? And based on all of those, one has some comprehensive bound, but often these are model dependent. Right? You have to have some model of dark matter particles, okay, and then you give a bound. In fact, today we are going to discuss another version of dark matter particles, right? The axionic dark matter, and for which we'll see that the bounds are way low, way below.
Okay.
So WIMPs specifically refers to particles which interact with weak interaction strength. And assuming that, you can give bounds that's of the order of 100 GeV, because the weak interaction strength particle which has of the order of 100 less than 100 GeV mass, I think we should be able to see it in experiments. Yeah, if you produce them and if you don't detect them, it will be as if you have lost some 100 GeV amount of energy in that collision process.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other question?
Yeah, so
Yes, go ahead.
So if we sort of don't if we ignore inflation for the time being,
yes,
we don't really have a baryon like this B minus L asymmetry, right? We can take it as an initial value problem.
Yeah, if you don't believe in inflation, right, then you can take it as an initial value problem, certainly.
And also there is no problem with there being a total charge in the universe, like conserved charge but total, like electric charge, but some positive or negative total charge.
Well, if the universe is closed, then you cannot have such a net total charge. Yeah, that you can easily check. On a sphere, for example, you cannot put a net charge, right? But if the universe is open, yes, you can in principle have a net positive total charge or negative total charge.
Why in the first case you cannot?
Because the flux has nowhere to go. See, the Gauss law, if the universe is compact, right? If it's a imagine that our spatial slice was a three-dimensional sphere.
Yeah.
Then the flux will have nowhere to go. See, normally if you put an electric charge in three-dimensional space, right, the flux goes to infinity. Right? So you can imagine that as if there is a negatively charged particle sitting at infinity, that our charge distribution sitting at infinity, and that's why the flux is ending. But if the universe has no boundary, right? I mean, if there is nothing at infinity, if it's like a sphere, then you can easily convince yourself that you cannot put a flux on that the flux has nowhere to go.
Yeah, but isn't this a sort of superfluous requirement that we need to have a like flux for somewhere to go, in the sense that, I mean, this is not a causal relationship, right? The bulk does
No,
not
it's
have
not.
a notion of the boundary a priori.
Yeah, no, okay. It's not. It's not. We are not even talking about time. Okay? Imagine that you have a spatial slice,
Yeah.
and you can integrate your electric field. Like just use Gauss law, right? Integral of the electric field over a closed surface should be equal to the total charge that is enclosed, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and if the space had been compact, okay, say like a sphere, then that surface you can deform. Normally you say you deform the surface to infinity and you count the total charge, right? But now the infinity is like a point. Okay, as you go radially outwards, I mean, you think of it as two-dimensional sphere. Okay, it's easier to visualize two dimension, right? So in two dimension, right, if you have a plane, then you can have circles which enclose a point, and then you can expand the circle, go up to infinity. Okay? But if it's not a plane but a sphere, then the circle eventually contracts back, right?
Yeah.
So similarly, in three dimensional, suppose the three-dimensional space was a sphere, then this two-dimensional sphere will eventually contract as you start expanding it. Okay. And because you can contract it to zero size, that means the integral of f mu nu, the Gauss integral E dot ds must be zero, right? Because the ds is going to zero.
In this sense, yeah, but I mean, there is no reason, in the sense that what you were saying earlier, that gauge symmetry is broken or something.
No, that's not the reason. So that's why because you are not producing it, right? You are saying that initially you start with this much.
Yeah, a total charge to
Total,
begin with.
yeah. So that you can do if the universe was open,
I see. Okay.
but not if the universe is closed. Right? If the spatial slice is a sphere, then you can easily convince yourself that you cannot put a net charge on the sphere.
All right.
It's just inconsistent with the three-dimensional Gauss law.
And we do not want to violate that either.
Well, that follows from electromagnetism, right?
Yeah, we can, like, we cannot modify Maxwell's equation.
Well, as long as you maintain gauge invariance, right, you can show that there is always a version of Gauss law.
Okay.
Right, because the point is, as long as the equations, the Lagrangian involves f mu nu, you can show that there is d mu of something is equal to zero.
All right.
And that's a Gauss law, or equal to zero or equal to total charge.
Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, so today we are going to start describing a new kind of dark matter, okay, not WIMPs, okay, which are a different kind. So here I am not going to go into a very detailed discussion, but I'll just give a generally indicate what this is. So this is called axionic dark matter. So axions are, I mean, these are originally introduced in particle physics for quite different purpose, not as dark matter, okay, but to solve some of the puzzles in particle physics. Okay. But as far as we are concerned in this course, we'll think of axion as a low mass scalar field. Okay, so axions are low mass scalar fields. With approximate shift symmetry. So it's approximate, okay, and of course, putting a mass breaks that shift symmetry. So let me write down the action, okay, at least the quadratic term in the action. Okay, so these are quadratic term, and then there are interaction terms. Okay, often one thinks of this as writes this as a cosine potential, but for our purpose, this is good enough. And this approximate shift symmetry basically is the statement that the interaction terms. Okay, so first of all, this term clearly breaks that shift symmetry, right? Because it is not invariant under a constant shift of chi. But the interaction terms typically depend on chi through its derivatives, right? And so if you say shift chi by a constant, then the interaction terms remain invariant. So M is small. So we'll think of this as a classical field that is in the universe. And if we believe in inflation, okay, even this doesn't really require inflation. It's just the normal expansion of the universe itself is good enough. So basically what happens is that if you, because the universe is expanding, okay, the spatial inhomogeneities get smoothened out. Inhomogeneities in chi get smoothened out. Okay. Which basically means that we can ignore the grad chi is not almost equal to 0. Okay. If it's a classical field, then the gradient of chi is almost equal to 0. So we'll in further analysis, we'll basically ignore the spatial derivatives of chi. And then it's a simple exercise, okay, to check that the equations of motion of chi in FRW metric takes the form chi double dot plus 3h chi dot plus m square chi equal to 0, where h is lambda dot over lambda. Okay, this is a function of time. And here you assume del square chi nearly equal to 0. Otherwise, there will be also term involving del square chi. So now if you look at this equation, it's clear that this is like a damped harmonic oscillator. Okay. And now you can study its time evolution. Okay. So in the early universe, h is large. Okay. In particular, h is much larger than m. In this case, we can ignore the last term, m square chi term. Okay. And there is a simple solution, which is that chi is just constant. Okay. And the value of this constant at which chi is that basically depends on the region of the universe we are in. Could depend on the region of the universe. Okay. Which basically means that imagine that before inflation, chi was different in different parts, right? By could be even by thermal fluctuation. Okay. But as inflation happens, okay, the small regions get blown up to big regions. Okay. So our the whole visible universe, okay, is like a small part of the universe before inflation. where chi was almost a constant. And that is a constant value that will be relevant for our universe. Okay, so it could be anything in principle. Okay, randomly chosen by just by the initial condition that comes out at the end of inflation. So what we are going to do is to study what happens when H goes below M. Okay, because when H is much larger than M, as I said, the system is overdamped. So basically, like an overdamped system, it doesn't move. Right, the universe is expanding fast. So in the time the universe expands, its movement is very small. The movement of chi. But now let's consider the case that as the universe expands.
So by the statements that it depends on the region on the universe, you mean in the patch of inflation?
Yes, in the patch of inflation that describes us. Exactly. Yeah, that in a different patch, chi may take different values. So as the universe expands, okay, H falls. And so when H is much smaller than M, then we can ignore the H term. We can ignore the 3H phi dot term, because in this case, this damping term is small. And the equation takes the form chi double dot plus M square chi equal to 0. So that's like a harmonic oscillator. And the solution is chi equal to, say, chi naught, the initial value, and then cosine of mt plus cosine mt. Let's put a constant. Okay. Some constant. So the chi field starts oscillating. Okay, it starts oscillating with a period of M inverse. Now, another set of simple exercise. Okay, that if you start with the Lagrangian that the action that we wrote down and calculate the rho and p from there. Okay, the t mu nu, calculate t mu nu by taking the derivative with respect to g mu nu, and then from calculate rho and p. And again, you ignore the spatial derivative term. Then rho is given by half chi dot square plus half m square chi square. Often in this analysis, you will see that instead of just m square chi square, you write some potential v of chi. Okay, which could be the standard form of the potential that people take is cosine potential. But let's just work with this for now. Okay, the results really don't change. So for illustrating what the main point, I think this is good enough. So we have these relations. And now the M may be small, but M is still big enough. Okay, so that we can talk about we can average. Okay, because period is M inverse, right? So over the time scale of expansion of the universe, if there are many oscillations, then you can still take the average. Okay. And so the average P, this is over a period, is like average of chi dot square minus half m square chi square, and this in fact is 0. Okay, this is a standard property of the harmonic oscillator, or in fact on any oscillatory motion in a potential, that the average value of the kinetic term and the potential terms are the same. Okay. And you can check from here, because chi dot will have an m times chi 0, right? So when you average over a period, then whether it's cosine or sine, of course, doesn't matter. and chi dot square average and the m square chi square average are the same. On the other hand, average rho of course is not 0 because there is a plus sign. Okay, and this in fact becomes sine square plus cosine square. So this is non-zero. So this is roughly half m square chi 0 square. So you see from here that this scalar field, okay, the energy density of the scalar field acts as if it's a pressureless matter because it has rho non-zero but pressure 0. So we have T mu nu for which P is 0, rho is not equal to 0. So it acts as non-relativistic matter. So this is what is called the axionic dark matter. Are there questions?
So
Does it not have any particle description?
Yeah, so I'm going to give the particle description.
So what did you say about the interactions in the beginning?
That the interactions are derivative interactions.
And this is because we want a chi equal constant thing.
Yeah, exactly. The shift symmetry. I mean, so the axions are, as I said, the axions, of course, were introduced in particle physics for quite different purpose, and they have the property that their interactions are typically derivative interactions.
Okay.
Okay, so the particle interpretation I'm going to give in a minute. But are there other questions on this? Okay, so now let's try to look at the particle interpretation. So in momentum space, so in quantum field theory, we have a harmonic oscillator for each momentum. Yeah, that's the way you quantized the free field. So in particular, the omega is square root of k square plus m square, right? So for each k, you have a harmonic oscillator. Now here, what we see is that a classical oscillation of this field, okay? So we can ask a classical oscillation of harmonic oscillator, what does it describe? The classical oscillation of a harmonic oscillator. If you want to describe it in quantum theory, okay, this is like a coherent state. Okay, which can be thought of as a superposition of highly excited states of a harmonic oscillator. Okay, that's the way we try to describe a classical harmonic oscillator. So that's the way we should try to interpret this if you want to have a quantum interpretation. This oscillation of the axionic field that we see, right? We should think of this as a highly excited state of the corresponding harmonic oscillators. But let's try to translate it to the language of particles. So you also know that in QFT, highly excited harmonic oscillator state, highly excited states, the harmonic oscillator, corresponds to large number of particles. Yeah, because each A dagger creates a particle. Okay, so if you have A dagger to the n with a large value of n, that's like having a lot of particles. And finally, since chi is uniform, okay, that means grad chi you have assumed is nearly equal to 0. Okay. We see that only k equal to 0 modes are excited. So even though you have a large number of particles, all of these particles have nearly 0 momentum. These have nearly 0 momentum. Okay. So from this viewpoint, axionic dark matter we can think of this as a sort of collection of large number of light particles of almost 0 momentum. And it is almost 0 momentum is what is responsible for zero pressure. For why it represents non-relativistic matter. So this is different from the WIMPs that we saw, okay, or various other kinds of dark matter, in the sense that they are at the production it's produced as non-relativistic particle, and as you saw that's needed in order that its energy density doesn't exceed the radiation energy density too early, and because it's produced at a temperature, okay, which is below its mass. When it's produced, it's produced as non-relativistic particles. And then it also, I mean, whatever velocity is there, it loses energy, but its production itself it's non-relativistic. Axions, on the other hand, okay, are different in the sense that we'll estimate the temperature at which it's produced. Okay. But the temperature at which it's produced is much higher than the mass of the axionic particle. Okay. So if it was the usual thermal production, then the axions will be produced relativistically. And only when the temperature comes below the mass of the axion, then they start behaving like non-relativistic dark matter. Okay. But that for low mass axions, that's too low a temperature, right? I mean, that's too late in the history of the universe for it to do anything. Okay, for example, the structure formation for which you need this non-relativistic matter, if the temperature is too low when it starts becoming non-relativistic, then it's not useful for structure formation. But here, even though it's produced at higher temperature, effectively it starts behaving non-relativistic from the time of production because it's produced with a very, very low momentum. Okay, and that is related to the fact that the axions are, that the field was uniform to begin with.
Just to clarify, these are produced out of equilibrium, right?
Yeah, these are produced out of equilibrium because the chi starts oscillating, right? That's not part of the thermal equilibrium.
Yeah, through weak interaction or anything.
Yeah, exactly. And the point is that you can ask that why doesn't energy density in chi thermalize? It could get mixed up. But if the mass is small, okay, and if the momentum are very small, okay, then because the interaction is a derivative interaction, okay, that means the interaction strength is proportional to some power of the momentum. And because of that, the interaction is weak. Okay, and that's the reason why this doesn't get diffused into ordinary matter, for example. Okay, an ordinary light particle, okay, it will thermalize by its interaction with other matter. Yeah, but the axionic coupling, so you need that fact that the axionic coupling is weak, right? Its interaction with everything else is through derivatives.
Sir, what a purpose like to introduce such kind of dark matter in the universe? Like,
Well, the point is this is a possibility, right? When
okay,
we don't know what dark matter is, right? So you have to look for various kinds of possibilities. WIMPs are one kind of possibilities, but these are also possibilities, right? So our dark matter that you have in the universe could be these,
okay,
right? So at present we don't know which one it is, right? It could be these or WIMPs or maybe something completely different.
they are also weakly interacting.
These are also weakly interacting, but weakly interacting for a different reason, that their interaction is always through derivatives.
Okay, sir, could you please explain what is like derivative interaction?
Well,
I-
derivative interaction basically means that all interaction terms involve derivatives of chi.
Okay,
I mean, there is no interaction of the form chi psi bar psi, for example, right? These kinds of interactions are not there. So all the interactions involve derivative of chi and then something else.
okay, okay, sir.
That's what one means by derivative interaction.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Any other question? And so because it's a derivative, right, when you convert it to momentum space, this becomes kv, right, where k is the momentum carried by chi. And its spatial components are zero, or almost zero, and the time component, which is square root of k square plus m square, is small because m is small. Okay, that's why it's the interaction strength is small. Okay, so you can also estimate the time or the temperature at which this is produced. Okay, so remember the axia, the production time. Okay, that when, okay, so the axions begins to roll. Okay, that's why I say that that's when it's produced. Begins to roll when h is of order m, right? The damping term becomes of the same order as the restoring force. Okay. So h is lambda dot over lambda. Okay, and if we use the Friedman equation, that's like square root of 8 pi g by 3, then half ab t to the 4 times n. So this is roughly, okay, up to numerical factor, t square comes out. And okay, so we are setting h equal to m, right? Okay, so h is equal to m. So let me write that equation again. So m is t square times square root 8 pi g by 3 times half ab times n, right? These are all numbers. Ab is like pi square by 15, n is some effective number of degrees of freedom. Okay. So g carries dimension, and just from dimension, since for g equal to 1, everything is measured in terms of the Planck units. Okay. This you can easily convince yourself, this is like t square over m Planck. Okay, times some constant, numerical constant, which you don't care about right now. Okay. So you see that this happens at temperature of order square root of m times m Planck. Okay. And this is much larger than m. Right? Because m Planck is much larger than m. So the axionic, rolling of the axion field begins at a temperature that is much larger than the mass of the axion. So if this happened as by the usual thermal production, then the axions will be produced relativistically. Okay, they will come with relativistic momentum. But because of this peculiar way the axion is produced, this through this coherent oscillation, even though that it's produced at a high temperature, it behaves as non-relativistic matter right from the beginning. Is this okay? Are there questions?
So do we use this to specify the temperature that they are being created at, or to bound the mass?
Well, of course, we don't know what temperature it might have been created at, right? So we have to see what kind of physical observable consequence it will have, right?
Yes, it should be before galaxy formation and
Exactly, yeah. So that of course is needed. Right? So we need to know the. So given the value of n, we can work out its consequences, but there are also other bounds, right? I mean, you should make sure that even though it has small interaction, right, there are large number of the axion fields, right? So if, for example, the axion decays into a pair of photons, they will be observed, and we have bounds on how many excess photons we see in the universe. So using that, we can put bounds on the mass of the axion and so on. Right? So they are very, so given any scenario, right? I mean, you may propose a scenario to solve one problem, okay, namely structure formation of in the universe. But you have to make sure that it's not inconsistent with anything else that you observe. So using that, you can put bounds on these masses and so on. So I think that I'll just give a reference. Okay, this is of course it's a very old subject, but a recent discussion you can find here. Okay, and there you can also find more information. So 16. Okay, so they are in fact, I think as far as I remember, they consider masses like 10 to the minus 22 electron volt. Okay, and that's seems to be consistent with everything that you know. But if you look at this, you will find much more information about the subject. And this, I mean, it could also be one of the project topics, right? To elaborate more on axionic dark matter.
So do we need to assume the interaction of these axions with standard model particles?
Do we need to assume? Okay, no, you don't need to assume, right? But typically what happens is that at least the original axion that was introduced, right, has a gamma-gamma coupling, okay, axion gamma-gamma coupling. But it depends on the axion mass with a very high power. So as long as the axion is light enough, you can escape detection. But I mean, what you are saying, it could be some particle which is doesn't interact with the standard model particles at all, except through gravity. Right? That's also possible. Yeah. So in which case it will escape detection. Right? If it doesn't couple to the standard model particles.
Yeah. Because but people propose to, I mean, detect these axions, right?
Yeah. So those are typically for these QCD axions, right, which have very specific coupling to standard model particles, because they are, as QCD axions, they are introduced to solve a problem in QCD, right, which is the particle physics problem, and there that comes with a very definite coupling to the standard model particles. In particular, there is a possible decay channel which is to a pair of gammas.
Okay. Yeah.
So these are all model dependent, right? I mean, so when you say that you will try to detect axionic dark matter, again, you are trying to look for a specific kind of axionic dark matter. Are there other questions? Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the last topic, okay, which will be a long topic. So I don't think that the course is over. Okay, it will probably go on for another 12 or 13 lectures. Okay? And that will be inflation. So you have already introduced inflation earlier. Okay, I mean, what purpose it serves. In particular, we saw that inflation is needed for solving the horizon and flatness problem. Okay. And so let me just give you a brief reminder of what it was. Right, it basically postulated that early in the history of the universe, there are some scalar field phi with a potential which had a flat piece. Okay, and this we are going to make qualitative, I mean, more quantitative as we proceed. Okay. And the idea was that as the scalar field rolls along this flat piece, the universe expands exponentially. Okay, so the v of phi is almost constant over some range of phi. And in this range, the universe expands exponentially. And this we saw solves some problems. Like horizon problem and flatness problem. So what we want to investigate first, that we say that v of phi is nearly constant. But what do you mean by nearly constant? How constant should it be? Right? How much of a slope can we allow? Okay, so that's what we are going to study first. Okay. So what we'll be studying is what is called slow roll inflation. Okay, and I'll explain what is the technical definition of what a slow roll means. Okay. So let's again start with the action, okay, which is very similar to what we saw just a few minutes ago, but of course in a very different context. And as we discussed that spatial inhomogeneities in phi, they get smoothened out quickly. As inflation progresses. Okay. So we'll assume we'll set grad phi to 0. Okay, in subsequent analysis, at least for now. Okay, later on when we study quantum fluctuations, then we'll have to put back this term. Okay, but at least for the classical analysis, we can just set this equal to 0 for now. Okay. So then we get our equation of motion, okay, which is the same as what we saw. Phi double dot plus 3h phi dot. Okay, and this time I'm going to write it in a more general term, v prime phi equal to 0 for a general potential. And let me remind you that rho is half phi dot square plus v phi, and p is half phi dot square minus v phi. And let me also write down the expression for h of t. So h of t is lambda dot over lambda, which is square root of 8 pi g over 3 times rho. So that's square root of 8 pi g over 3 half phi dot square plus v phi. So given this, I'll now write down what are known as flow roll conditions. So h is the expansion rate, okay, at time t. So roughly the time required for lambda to double is of order h inverse. Okay. More precisely, we can say that the time of order h inverse lambda changes by fraction of itself. Okay, it increases by order lambda. Okay, doubling requires a precise coefficient here. Okay, but this is roughly. So h inverse roughly gives to the time scale over which the universe is expanding. So what we want is a nearly exponential expansion, because that's what inflation is about. At least that's what slow roll inflation is about. So nearly exponential expansion. H dot h should not change much during this time. That means that by the time the universe has doubled in size, okay, the rate of expansion of the universe shouldn't change very much. Right? It should remain constant. Because if it's strictly constant, then it's exponential expansion. Okay. But we do not demand strictly a constant h. Okay. But at least you demand that over a time scale of order h inverse, h shouldn't change very much. Okay. So that basically means that h dot, this is the rate of change of h, times h inverse. Okay, that's the net change in h in a time h inverse. So this should be small compared to h. And typically h will go down with time. Okay, so h dot is negative. Why is it negative? Because I mean, if you think of h, right, rho is actually decreasing because v is slowly rolling down, so that v is becoming smaller and smaller, right? So h is decreasing, h dot is, so even the h dot is small, it's actually negative. So one introduces the first slow roll parameter. So epsilon is defined to be minus h dot over h square. This is called the first slow roll parameter. And one of the conditions for slow roll that one imposes is that epsilon should be small. Are there questions? Because small epsilon, by this argument, guarantees that the expansion is nearly exponential. Okay, it's not exactly exponential, but it's nearly exponential. Now, one also introduces what is called a second slow roll parameter. Second slow roll parameter. eta, which is defined as minus phi double dot over phi dot times H inverse. So small eta means that phi double dot times H inverse. Okay, I'll put small mod eta. Phi double dot times H inverse should be less than phi dot. Okay, let's put a magnitude on both sides. So this means what? This means that the change in phi dot over time H inverse should be small compared to phi dot. Because phi double dot times H inverse is a change in phi dot over a period H inverse. Now this is not necessary for anything, right? Because this is not related to the expansion of the universe. So this is not necessary. But is a useful criteria, is a useful condition to impose for simplifying the analysis. So let me emphasize again. So epsilon small guarantees that the expansion of the universe is nearly exponential. Even that is not strictly necessary, right? Because all you need is that the horizon problem should be solved. Okay? So the universe should expand sufficiently fast, but it did not be exponential. Okay? In fact, if I remember correctly, we had given an exercise, right, to see how fast the universe should expand, okay, to solve the horizon problem. And of course, exponential expansion does it, but it's not necessary. Eta small is also not necessary. It's not even necessary for exponential expansion. But we'll see that the smallness of eta makes life simpler because it allows us to make several approximations and get analytic formula. So slow roll inflation normally refers to conditions of inflation under which both eta and epsilon are small. Are there questions? Okay. So what you are going to do now is to try to translate this into conditions on V. Try to translate this namely, what kind of potential do we need to achieve this slow roll conditions? So for that, let's again begin. H squared is 8 pi g over 3 times half phi dot square plus v of phi. So if we take the derivative, okay, take d dt, that gives you 2h h dot as 8 pi g over 3 times this becomes phi double dot times phi dot plus v prime phi dot. Okay. And now let me write down the equations of motion for phi double dot plus 3h phi dot plus v prime phi equal to 0. Yeah, so if you use this, you see the phi double dot plus v prime phi can be combined, to 3h phi dots. So this becomes minus 8 pi g phi dot square. Phi dots square times h. H. Okay. So epsilon, which was minus h dot over h square. Okay, we can calculate from here. So h dot over h square will be 4 pi g phi dot square over h square. And now we substitute this again. So that gives you phi dot square. There's a 8 pi g over 3, so 3 phi dot square over phi dot square plus 2v phi. So this means that small epsilon means that phi dot square must be small compared to v phi. Is this clear? So this is still not a condition on the potential as yet, but soon it will be translated to condition on the potential after you impose a small eta condition. Okay, right now, for just by demanding small epsilon, we see that this condition has to hold. Now let's look at eta. So eta was minus phi double dot over phi dot h. So this was, so phi double dot, we can use the equation of motion to write this as 3h phi dot plus v prime phi. Okay, the minus sign went away over phi dot h. So this tells us that 3h phi dot plus v prime phi should be small. Should be small compared to the individual terms. You see, here below you have phi dot h. Okay, that's of the same order as this. So if this quantity has to be small compared to the denominator, then this 3h phi dot plus v prime phi should be small compared to phi dot h. And that means that phi dot h is of order minus v prime phi, so it should also be small compared to v prime phi. So small eta gave us this condition, 3h phi dot plus v prime phi should be small. Now let's go back to the previous equation. You see, we had gotten this phi dot square much smaller than v prime phi, v phi. So okay, so what we claim is that phi dot square. So this means, okay, let me write it. So from here we can write phi dot is nearly equal to minus v prime phi over 3h. So phi dot square much less than v phi will now tell us that v prime phi square is much less than 9h square V phi. But h square was 8 pi g over 3 times half phi dot square plus V phi. And because phi dot square is small compared to V phi, we can write this as 8 pi g over 3 V phi. So after you substitute this, it will tell us that V prime phi square is much less than 9 times 8 pi g over 3. So that gave 3. So 24 pi g. 24 pi g times V of phi square. Is this clear? So basically what we did was that we took the slow roll conditions, epsilon small, eta small, and then manipulated the equations, okay, combined them to start eliminate phi dot basically, right? That's what we have done essentially. Okay, phi double dot of course can be eliminated from the beginning by using its equation of the equation of motion. Okay. But phi dot we started eliminating by using this condition. Okay, and that's how we got one condition on the potential. Okay. Now I have to get one more condition because after all we had two conditions to begin with, right? One on eta small and one for epsilon small. Okay. This we have got by combining the two. Okay, so that's just one way to combine the two. But we will now see that there is another way of combining the two, which will give a second condition. Okay. No further input at this stage. Okay, only the smallness of epsilon and eta are being used. Is this clear so far? Okay, so now let me start with this again. Okay, so we have phi dot equal to minus V prime phi over 3h. Okay, that came from this condition. That's this condition, right? So let's take a derivative of this. Okay, because we want to get phi double dot and then substitute in the equation of motion. So then this gives you phi double dot is, these are all approximate equations. Minus V double prime. Okay, I'll not write the argument phi, it's understood. V double prime over 3h times phi dot. And then plus V prime phi over 3h square times h dot. So eta is phi double dot over phi dot h. Okay, so let's substitute this. So you have to divide by phi dot h. Okay, what did I do here? This should be phi double dot by phi dot h. So phi double dot is here. So this gives you V prime double prime phi dot gets cancelled over 3h square minus V prime h dot over 3 h square phi dot. H square or h cube? Sorry, there's h because they're already in h square here. There's a h here, so h cube. So this quantity is the claim is this is, okay, so this is h dot over h square, which is small, times v prime over 3h phi dot. Now, v prime over 3h phi dot is almost equal to 1, right? That's from here, v prime over 3h phi dot is almost equal to -1. But this is the epsilon. And you have already imposed the condition that epsilon is small. So this is small. And this is of order 1. This is 1. Nearly equal to 1 or -1. So smallness of eta means this must be small. So mod eta much less than 1 implies that mod v double prime much less than 3h square, which is 8 pi g. H square is 8 pi g over 3 times rho. Okay. And inside rho, I'll now only include the v of phi because we have already seen that phi dot square is small compared to v phi. So we get the condition. Let me write it here. We get the condition that v double prime is much less than 8 pi g v phi. Is this clear so far? Okay. So this is more or less algebra and manipulation of those two equations. So let me again summarize the two equations that we have found. So what we got are the two equations v prime phi square should be much less than 24 pi g v of phi square, and v double prime phi should be much less than 8 pi g times v of phi. So these we'll call as Floerl condition. And here you will see that why the smallness of eta was useful. Because if we only demanded smallness of epsilon, that gave some condition involving phi dot square and phi v phi. But once you combine this with the smallness of epsilon, you could convert this to a statement on the potential itself. Okay, that potential must have this feature. Okay, that there should be some range of phi for which this holds. Okay, and the inflation takes place over that range of phi. At least you can say Floerl inflation takes place over that range of phi. Okay, that's the usefulness of these two Floerl conditions, because you can put a condition on the potential directly. Okay. But of course, we have to have other conditions. Okay, because after all, if this happens over a very small range of the potential, okay, the universe may not inflate enough, right? So that you have to make sure that there is enough inflation. So let me now state those other conditions. The other conditions, okay, which also will translate into condition on the potential. So the first condition is that if inflation, suppose the inflation lasts Ti to Tf, then lambda Tf over lambda Ti should be sufficiently large so as to solve the horizon and the flatness problem. And how large it should be depends on the scale of inflation. And we had given some estimates, right? That if inflation happened at 10 to the 16 GeV, then we need log of lambda TF over lambda TI to be larger than 60. Okay, this is what is called the 60 folding. Okay, but this number can change depending on the scale of inflation. Okay, but let's take this as a typical prototypical number. So let's now try to translate this into a statement on the potential. So during inflation, lambda dot over lambda is h. And if we use the fact that during inflation, for slow roll, okay, this is, and for slow roll, well, this is of course there's a definition, okay, but h is remaining constant, okay, during inflation. So for slow roll, we have this condition that 3h phi dot is nearly equal to minus v prime phi. Okay, that was, let's go back and check that. That's this one, right? 3h phi dot is equal to minus v prime phi. So you're going to use that to write this as, okay, let me write this and then we'll see if we agree. H square times minus 3 phi dot over v prime phi. Okay, why we are going to write it is this way, it will become clear soon. Okay. So because 3 phi dot over v prime phi is minus 1 over h, right? Okay. So this becomes 1 over h, and I'm multiplied by h square gives you h. Okay, so this looks like a somewhat strange way of writing it, okay, but it will be useful. So this tells us that ddt of log lambda is given by minus h square is 1 over v prime phi. Let me write. H square is 8 pi g over 3. And because during the slow roll inflation, phi dot square is small compared to v phi, I'll write this as v phi. And this one I'll write as just d phi dt. Sorry, 3 d phi dt. So the 3 cancels. And now you see that we can integrate this. So let me integrate this and let me write this here. So this implies, I'll use a different color so it's not confused. So log lambda f over lambda I is integral minus integral. You see, this was Ti to Tf. You would have integrated from Ti to Tf, okay, dt d phi dt. Okay. But d phi dt times dt I can write as d phi, okay, provided you change these limits from phi I to phi f. Okay. So I'm going to write this from phi I to phi f 1 over v prime phi (8 pi g over v prime prime). I just wrote this times d phi d phi. Is this step clear? Right. So I just wrote this as d log lambda equal to dt times this. Right? Dt times this is just d phi. So I integrated, okay, here on this side from the initial to final value, lambda I to lambda f. And here I integrated from initial to final value, which I'm calling phi I and phi f. Okay. So the definition is phi I is phi at Ti and phi f is phi at Tf. So you see that this condition can also be translated to a condition on the potential. Okay, so I'm going to write that in the next slide. So we see that the condition can be written as minus 8 pi g integral phi I to phi f and v of phi over v prime of phi d phi should be larger than 60. Okay. So the 60 is a variable. It depends on the scale of inflation, but I have just taken this as a prototype. So you see that this also translates to a condition on the potential. And then there is a final condition that is imposed. The final condition this is because of our inability to do calculations in that regime, that the quantum gravity effect should be small. And this translates to the condition. You see, so V of phi, okay, is a term that appears in the action or Lagrangian, okay, but it's actually a measure of energy density. Okay. So energy divided by L cube, okay, and L in the natural units of dimension of mass. So energy to the 4. Okay, so V of phi has dimension of mass to the 4. So in natural units, okay, we can if you set the g equal to 1, then you will say V phi should be small compared to 1. But once you put the restored g, then the condition turns out is basically V of phi should be small compared to m Planck to the 4. Okay, because this has mass dimension 4, so it should be small compared to m Planck to the 4. And this essentially ensures that the space-time curvature during inflation is small in Planck units. Is this clear?
Sir,
Yes, go ahead, please.
sir, is there any reason to believe that G has same value all the way to that much energy scale, really high energy scale?
That G has the same value? Yeah, so the point is that, okay, there are of course particle physics models where G is multiplied by some scalar field, vacuum expansion, or some function of a scalar field. And if the scalar field changes, then the G may change. But even if that happens, normally the kind of model that one uses, okay, that change in the value of the scalar field is of order 1, right? It may increase by a factor of 2 or 3, but it doesn't increase or decrease drastically. So even if in the cases where the So, okay. So the point is, of course, G, but if you think of G as a constant, it cannot change, right? But the way you allow G to vary is that in the Einstein-Hilbert action, you normally write this as root GR times 1 over 16 pi G, right? That's the way we write down the Einstein-Hilbert action normally. But instead of writing this 1 over 16 pi G, okay, you can write this as 1 over 16 pi times some G naught, which is some constant. And then inside the Lagrangian, inside the action, you can multiply the square root of minus determinant G times R by some function of a scalar field. And if the scalar field changes, then effectively the Newton's constant changes. But typically what the kind of model that one has, the change in the scalar field is not by a large amount. Okay, it can be by factors of 2 or 3, but not by a million or so. So because of this, we assume that G roughly has the same value. Okay, but it is possible that by multiplying by the scalar field, the actual value of G may be different from what you see today.
Okay, sir.
Any other question? Okay, so this looks like a lot of complicated conditions, but in fact, it's not so complicated. And I'll leave this as an exercise, and maybe next time we'll try to also work this out. Okay, but this is a simple exercise, you can do it yourself. And that is to check that all these 4 conditions can be satisfied by a simple class of potentials for appropriate choice of phi I and phi m. Okay, for appropriate choice. So these conditions have to be satisfied only between this range, right? Because that's where the inflation is taking place. Outside this range, you don't need those conditions between phi I and phi f. So the potential, the class of potential that will be that one can take is just this G phi to the alpha, where alpha is some constant larger than 2, okay, and G needs to be sufficiently small. Okay. So any alpha will be fine. Okay. So as long as G is sufficiently small, you can find an appropriate range of phi for which all these 4 conditions can be satisfied. Okay. And this, you can see that this includes a free scalar field with low mass. Okay, that's the simplest example of a scalar field potential where slow roll inflation is possible. Okay, so here, if you look at the beginning, the inflationary potential looked a bit complicated, right? Or a bit artificial. The way we had first introduced inflation, we had this flat part in the middle, and then the reheating part. Okay, reheating will come back in the next lecture. But it looked a little artificial potential. But what we see is that you don't really need this kind of artificial potential. Just a simple potential of this kind is going to do. Okay. So here let me just draw V and then I'll stop. So V versus phi. Just a quadratic potential. It's like this, right? Okay. So inflation basically happens over some range. and the field. So this is our initial point, and this is our final point, right? The field rolls like this during inflation. Okay, so I think I'll stop here, and next time we'll continue on this. Are there questions?
Sir, could you explain the last condition? Quantum gravity effect.
Yeah, so this is basically that if the V is of order m Planck to the 4, then the space-time curvature becomes of order 1 in Planck units. And there, the usual quantum field theory treatment is not going to work, right? You have to really understand the full details of quantum gravity. So this is just a convenience that by if you impose this condition, then we can just use the standard quantum field theory tricks, okay, to analyze what happens during inflation, and you don't need to actually study quantum gravity. So this is not necessary. It may even happen that the inflation actually took place during the era when quantum gravity was important. But if we want to do any explicit calculation involving inflation, then because we don't understand quantum gravity that well, we impose this condition so that we can actually use just the standard quantum field theory methods.
Okay, sir.
So this is basically our inability to deal with quantum gravity, right? Not that there is a physics reason why it has to happen this way.
Okay, sir. Sir, why we are taking, sir, G is a coupling constant in potential expression, I think.
Yes, G can be a coupling constant, yes.
Sir, why we are taking need to be sufficiently small?
We are taking what?
Sufficiently small.
Oh, that is necessary because you have to impose all those 4 conditions, right? The slow roll condition.
Okay.
So what I say that this condition, this simple potential satisfies all the slow roll conditions, but you have to take G to be sufficiently small.
To satisfy these 4 conditions.
Yeah, to satisfy these 4 conditions.
Okay, sir.
For G of order 1, you will find that these conditions are not satisfied.
Okay.
Any other question?
Yeah, sir.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, once you said that spontaneously breaking a gauge symmetry is also fine.
Yes.
Could you give an example and implication of that with mu?
With
The normal photonic gauge field?
Yeah, so what would happen is the photon will become massive if the gauge symmetry is spontaneously broken. Right? This probably you learn in your QFT2 course. Right? Standard model, that's precisely what happens. Right? You have this SU3 times SU2 times U1, but the SU2 times U1 gets spontaneously broken to U1, and that's the reason why the W plus minus and the Z bosons become massive. So if you want to do this just with photon, spontaneous breaking of U1 gauge symmetry, then the photon becomes a massive particle.
And what would you say is the cause for this in terms of what we see in the Lagrangian?
If a field which carries charge gets a vacuum expectation value, then this can happen.
Is it the Higgs which gets this?
Yeah. So in the standard model, is the Higgs which does this. Right? There, of course, the gauge symmetry associated with photon is not broken, right? It's so because SU2 times U1 is broken to U1. So one linear combination of SU2 generators and the U1 actually remains unbroken, and the associated charge is the electric charge. But the hypercharge, for example, is broken, right? The Higgs field carries a non-zero hypercharge, and that symmetry gets broken, and it carries some non-zero SU2 charge that also gets broken.
So even in a spontaneously broken process, we cannot have some creation of electric charge.
No, because electric charge is unbroken.
No, in this process it is, but can we imagine some other process?
That's where not some process, it's a property of the vacuum, right? Of the theory. So it's not that symmetry is spontaneously broken for each process separately. Right? It's just
the hypercharge was also an exact conserved charge, right?
Which one?
The hypercharge that you
yes.
said is broken spontaneously.
True. But the vacuum breaks hypercharge symmetry.
So That's a property of the vacuum, you're saying,
Yeah, that's a property of the vacuum.
and that preserves electric charge.
That preserves electric charge, yes. I mean, you could also imagine scenarios where electric charge would be broken, right? But that will be inconsistent with experiment, right? The reason that we keep the electric charge unbroken is because experimentally, the electric charge is not broken, that symmetry is not broken. But if you are just doing theory, right, you can certainly write down Lagrangian, where the electric charge symmetry will also be broken spontaneously.
Sir, what would you say is the analog for this for gravity in the sense of general coordinate invariance? Those are also we are treating as gauge charges, gauge transformations, right?
Yeah,
So that gauge symmetry also we want to say that it's preserved, but we
but
know that
okay, yeah, the analog of that will be if the transition invariance was broken.
yeah. So in the sense that we are already assuming a preferred time direction and all, so we are breaking that, right?
But see, that is not really in the vacuum, right? I mean, okay, in our universe, for example, okay, we are not in Minkowski space, right? But if the cosmological constant was 0, then
Yeah.
in the far future, we would approach a flat space, right? Because the matter will die out, and that's what we call the vacuum. In that vacuum, the transition invariance will be unbroken.
Yeah.
In the universe that we are in, with the cosmological constant, that is a de Sitter invariance, right? I mean, in the far future, when the matter dies out, it will have the symmetry of the de Sitter space. I mean, remember we introduced this.
Some formal symmetries.
Yeah, it's a formal symmetry. That's what generalizes the Lorentz and transition symmetry in flat space time.
So that can be spontaneously broken.
Then this de Sitter symmetry will be broken. Then the de Sitter symmetry will not be a symmetry of the theory.
So then why are we sort of doing cosmology in the first place? In the sense that we know that some sort of invariance has been broken. Like spatial isotropy is there, but there is a time direction for all matter, at least according to our assumption.
Yes.
So that is not compatible, at least as it stands, that is not compatible with general coordinate invariance, right?
Well, it is compatible with general coordinate invariance. It's that the way the symmetry is realized is different, right? I mean, the universe doesn't display the full time translation symmetry, right? But that's because the universe is evolving that way. Right? Meaning it's not. See, even in the standard model, right? SU3 times SU2 times U1 is a symmetry of the theory, right? And it's
Is that a statement like the symmetry of nature may not be a symmetry of our universe?
Exactly, right? The symmetry of the equations of motion may not be manifest as a symmetry of the vacuum.
This is because we are simply living in one particular solution of this Einstein's equation.
Well, it could be that way, right? That the Higgs field may have many different minima, and in some minima, maybe the symmetry will be unbroken, right? That's certainly possible, right? We don't know if our universe, I mean, if nature works that way in our universe, right? But if the Higgs potential, okay, was sufficiently complicated, then it may have minima of the kind that we are living in, right? But it may have another minima where the symmetry is restored. Okay, it will not work with just one field, right? You need other more fields in the problem, so that I mean, there are some other fields get vacuum expectation value, and at that vacuum, the minimum of the Higgs potential may be actually at 0. Yeah, if it's a potential of many fields, right, then it may have many different vacuum. Right? That's certainly a possibility that
Like in such a universe, then in a different vacuum, there won't be some sort of a time, like, right, a cosmic time.
yeah, possible that in a defined vacuum it will be completely static. Minkowski vacuum.
But like none of this is spontaneous breakdown or anything. Of the gravity of the general coordinate invariance, I mean.
Well, you can call this spontaneous breakdown of the general coordinate invariance, right? I mean, in each vacuum, a subgroup of the general coordinate invariance is unbroken, right? And the other parts are broken. So all of the symmetries, the Lorentz symmetry, for example, right? Our Poincare symmetry of the Minkowski spacetime is a part of general coordinate invariance, right? That is the unbroken part. Similarly, there may be different vacuum, right? In some vacuum, some part may be unbroken, some other vacuum, some other part may be unbroken.
So in such vacuum, will locally spaces look Minkowski, or even that won't happen?
Well, if the curvature is strong, then it will not happen. Right? Our space looks locally Minkowski because the curvature is small. Right? I mean, you have a cosmological constant, right? So there is a non-zero Riemann tensor. But that Riemann tensor is so small that it's imperceptible, right? I mean, you have to do a lot of experiments to figure out that you are actually living in a de Sitter universe, okay, with a cosmological constant.
Yeah.
But if the curvature is strong, right, then it will not be imperceptible. It will be visible. I mean, the day-to-day experience will be very different from what we see in the Minkowski space.
So that is okay, but like when we start writing some equations for the metric, we always say that through general coordinate invariance, locally we can always bring the metric to Minkowski.
Okay, yeah. So that you can always do. If you can ignore, so if from that viewpoint, right? If you only are interested in the first derivative you can always set equal to 0.
Yeah.
So that is a property of general coordinate invariance. So that you can certainly do.
But even then, the higher derivative terms might be relevant, you're saying, for higher curvature.
Doesn't matter. As long as you have general coordinate invariance, right? You can always find a locally inertial frame in which G mu is eta mu nu, and the first derivative is 0. The second derivative may not be small.
Yeah.
So that part doesn't depend on actual metric. Right? So the metric may have certain isometry, right? So from general coordinate invariance, I mean, that's the way to think of this, that what is the isometry of the metric that you have? And that is the analog of the unbroken group. Okay, the isometry of the space-time. General coordinate invariance is a full symmetric group.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I think maybe in the next class, maybe waiting, so I have to stop. So we'll meet next week on Wednesday.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.